Chapter 18, Part 2 of Ireland Under the Tudors, Volume 1, by Richard Bagwell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Reign of Mary. The moral which Sussex drew from this inglorious expedition was that the north could only be held by a chain of forts along the coast from Dundalk to Locke. Some part at least of the expense would be paid by the salmon fisheries of the Foyle, the Bann, and the Bush, and by the herring, cod, ling, and hake fisheries of which Carlingford was the chief seat. A good English bishop would also, he thought, be a means to civilize the country. It had not yet been discovered that making the church a badge of conquest only served to make religion itself odious. The dislike of the Irish to English ecclesiastics had been marked throughout the Middle Ages, and even if England had remained in communion with Rome, bishops who were government officials first and chief pastors afterwards could scarcely have ministered successfully to the wants of O'Neills and O'Donnells. The settlement of Leix was in outward form completed, and Sussex received the Queen's thanks for it. The arrangements were not without a show of equity, but the old inhabitants could not reconcile themselves to the intrusion of a colony, and their pertinacious opposition forced the government to treat them with far more rigor than had been at first intended. The western half of the new Queen's County was originally reserved for the O'Moores, each head of a sept becoming a landlord holding an estate entailed by knight service. The chiefs were prohibited from keeping any idle men except of their own sept, or more than one for every 100 acres. They were to attend the constable of the fort when required, to repair bridges, and at all times to keep the passes open between their districts and those occupied by the English. They were to dress like Englishmen, except when riding, and to teach their children to speak English, to attend the deputy annually, and to use only the common law. All above 12 were required to take the oath of allegiance. Forfeiture was prescribed for a persistent refusal to keep the passes open, for retaining superfluous idlemen, for keeping more than one set of harness, for interrupting communication with the English, for making a private way, for marrying and fostering with the Irish, and for absenteeism. The deputy's license removed the penalty in all these cases. For keeping unlicensed firearms, the first offence was to be punished by forfeiture, and the second by death. The eastern district was assigned to the English to hold on similar terms, and 12 places, among which Stradbally and Abbeyleix are the best known, were to be kept in a defensible state as satellites to the royal fort of Maryborough. The duties of the settlers were in general the same as those assigned to the O'Moores, but whereas the latter were restrained in the matter of arms, the possession of them was made obligatory on the former. A good bow, a good bow, and sheaf of arrows, or one handgun at least, was to be kept in every house. Forfeiture was to be incurred in the same way as by the Irish, and in addition for falling away from the use of the English tongue, for holding more than 300 acres in demesne, or for entertaining Irishmen, except so far as they were necessary for husbandry. A few natives whose services as captains of kerne had deserved special recognition were to have grants in the English territory, and it was suggested that a large territory should be offered to the Earl of Kildare. A constable resident at the fort was to have the same powers locally as the Lord Deputy had generally. Stringent rules were made as to free quarters and purveyance. The constable or president on his annual circuit was to have his own expenses and those of 4 men and 5 horses, borne for one night only by each town, and each sept of the O'Moores was to bear the like burden, and no more. Finally, a church was to be built in each of the 12 settlements within 3 years, and a parson of English birth was to have the tithe. Whatever the intentions of the Queen or her deputy might be towards Leix and Offaly, there was sure to be plenty of opposition on the part of the natives, who were, however, as usual, divided among themselves. The old chief, Brian O'Connor, was still alive, and his son Donogh carried on the old feud and killed his cousin, the son of Cahir Roe. Both Donogh and Conall O'More, the chief of Leix, fell into the hands of Sussex in the course of the year, but to the surprise of the Irish in general were released in deference to Kildare and Ormond, who had become in some measure responsible for them. The O'Moores remained quiet for a time on the lands reserved to them. Donogh and others of the O'Connors afterwards came to Sussex at Philipstown, as the fort of Offaly must henceforth be called, and made their submission, giving promises of good behaviour, which they immediately broke. After the meeting at Philipstown, Sussex and his council repaired to Leighlin, where the principal O'Connors neglected to appear as they had promised. A leader of the Kavanaghs, who had not taken warning by the recent fate of his clansmen, was executed, and Conall O'More, who had once more broken into rebellion, was hanged in chains at Leighlin about the same time. Offaly was next invaded, and hostages taken, who were executed on a further outbreak taking place, with the exception of O'Connor himself, who was detained prisoner in Dublin. The Parliament, from which Mary expected much, for the church of which she was so faithful a daughter, met at last and enacted all the laws made in England against the Protestants. The old statutes against La Lardy, which prescribed death by fire as the punishment for obstinate or relapsed heretics, were declared to be in full force. A communication from Pole was read by Kerwin as Chancellor, kneeling down in open session, in which the Cardinal urged the Assembly to restore Ireland to full communion with the Church. All acts derogatory to the Pope, which had been passed since the 20th year of Henry VIII, were accordingly repealed. The Queen was declared a legitimate absolute sovereign, and all laws and sentences to the contrary were abrogated. On the other hand, grants of monastic land were confirmed. There could be no doubt of Mary's wish to restore the religious houses, but this does not appear to have been done except in the single case of Kilmainham. Oswald Massingberd, who during the Puritan ascendancy had led a wandering life in the woods, was appointed prior by Pole, and the nomination was confirmed by the Queen. Massingberd was sworn of the council and assumed the position of his predecessors, but he seems to have had no belief in the stability of the new system. He gave long leases and sold all that was saleable, and he took no thought for the morrow. There appears to have been no intention of specially favouring the obsolete order of Sir St. John, for no attempt was made to restore it in England. But in Ireland it happened that the Crown had not parted with the house and lands. In the same way, since it could be done without offending vested interests, Mary re-established the Benedictines at Westminster, the Carthusians at Sheen, and the Observants at Greenwich. There are indications that she wished to examine titles closely and to restore the monks where defects appeared, but she granted and confirmed grants of abbey lands as freely as her father and brother. 90 years later, when the Confederate Catholics had military possession of the greater part of Ireland, and the Nuncio Rinuccini was apparently all-powerful, the claim of the regulars to their old possessions was met by the nobility and gentry with anger and scorn. When released from his parliamentary duties, Sussex marched westward against the O'Connors, who, under Donogh, had possessed themselves of Meelick Castle on the Shannon. The line of march lay through Offaly by Killick, Ballyboy, and Clogan, no opposition being offered by the O'Moores or O'Maddens. The Shannon was reached on the third day. Clanricarde must have been in a tolerably peaceful state, for Athlone Pursuivant seems to have had no difficulty in going to Galway to seek ammunition and provisions. Cannon were brought by water from Athlone and planted in the grounds of the friary on an island or peninsula on the Galway side of the stream. The castle was summoned, and a cautionary shot fired without effect. Next day the cannonade began, and at the 16th shot at large, O'Carroll and other chiefs came to pay their respects to Sussex, and may well have laughed at the small results achieved by the display of irresistible force. A garrison was placed in the castle, and hostages having been taken from the neighbouring clans, the army returned through MacCaughlan's country, led by the chief himself. The Lord Deputy had the pleasure of seeing the night lit up by fires which the rebels kindled within a mile of his camp. The outlying buildings at Philipstown were all burnt, and arrows shot into the fort itself. Such was the practical outcome of a 9 days' expedition, during which, as the annalists say, it is not easy to state or enumerate all that was destroyed. An expedition into Ulster, undertaken 3 months later, he had the same lame and impotent conclusion. The annalists say compendiously that Armagh was burned twice in 1 month by Thomas Sussex. His horsemen encamped in the cathedral, and no enemy opposed the destroyer, who returned after a week to Dundalk, only to hear that Shane O'Neill was burning and plundering within 4 miles of the town. Being pursued, Shane retreated to his woods, whither those who knew the country declined to follow him. Sussex then returned to Dublin, the Queen being richer by a few cows, and Sir James Garland poorer by the village which O'Neill had burned. Not much impressed by the late invasion, the O'Connors, who had escaped from Meelick, stationed themselves at Leap Castle, about which there had been so much fighting in bygone days. Sussex took the castle without trouble, but Donogh again escaped by the speed of his horse, and the stronghold was seized by O'Carroll as soon as the army had left. Sidney afterwards made 2 separate inroads into the same district. O'Malloy was proclaimed a traitor, and everything destroyed. It is not easy to see how there could be anything combustible left in the devoted country. The O'Carrolls were also engaged about this time in opposition to the government, and in support of the O'Moores and O'Connors, and the annalists are again at a loss to enumerate the praise and slaughter which were made from the Shannon to the Nore. A local war of considerable importance took place this year between the O'Neills and O'Donnells. Manus, the old chief of Tyrconnell, had been kept a prisoner for the last 2 years by his son Calvach, who assumed the leadership. This claim was disputed by his brother Hugh, who, with his immediate adherents, had deserted to Shane O'Neill. Shane was delighted at the opportunity of interfering, and declared that not one cow should escape, though the O'Donnells should carry away their cattle into Leinster or Munster. He himself would in future be the sole king of Ulster. Shane pitched his camp at Corriglia, near Strabane, just above the junction of the Finn and the Mourne. It was more a fair than an encampment, and the time was gaily passed in buying, and no doubt in drinking wine and mead, as well as fine clothes and merchandise. Calvach, who lay 5 miles off, with a few followers, sent 2 trusty spies to the camp, who mingled boldly with the throng of camp followers and soldiers belonging to many different clans. In front of Shane's tent they found a great central fire, and a huge torch as thick as a man's body blazing brightly. 60 gallaglasses with their axes, and as many Scots with heavy broadswords drawn, stood ready to guard the chief. When the time came for serving out supper, the spies claimed their share with the rest, and received a helmet full of meal and a corresponding quantity of butter. Not staying to make cakes, they carried back the trophy to Calvach, who immediately got his men under arms. He had 2 companies of the McSweeney gallaglasses and 30 horsemen. No lookout was apparently kept at the camp, which they entered at once. There they had little to do but to kill till their arms were tired, the deficiency of force being much more than counterbalanced by the totally unprepared state of the O'Neills. Shane, whose reputation for courage is not high, slipped out at the back of his tent with only 2 companions, leaving his men to their fate. The 3 fugitives threaded the passes of the neighbouring mountains and passed the Vin, the Deal, and the Derg by swimming. At Turman Nemagan, near the latter river, Shane bought a horse and never rested till he reached the neighbourhood of Clocker. Calvach remained in possession of the camp, and his men spent the rest of the night in drinking the wine which the O'Neills had provided for themselves. The extent of the plunder may be estimated from the fact that Con, Calvach's young son, who had given up his horse to his father and fought on foot, now had 80 steeds for his share, including a celebrated charger of Shane's called the Eagle's Son. Sussex had not been very long in Ireland before he asked for a holiday, and he was allowed to spend Christmas at home. Kerwin and Sidney, and afterwards Sidney only, being appointed Lords Justices. War had been declared with France at midsummer, and one of the first letters received by the new governor announced the loss of Calais and the Queen's vain hope of recovering it. In the storm of St. Quentin and the defence of Gisnes, English soldiers had shown that they were made of the same stuff as the victors of Agincourt. But the war was unpopular. Mary's subjects felt that they were sacrificed to Philip, and this jealousy of Spain both caused the fall of Calais and prevented its recovery. But the national vanity was sorely hurt, and Sidney thought it a good opportunity to point out that James Macdonald was expected in Ulster with many French and Scotch allies, and that the natives would join him or fall upon the Pale, which was itself heartily sick of English rule, of soldiers at free quarters, and of payers who paid, if they paid all, something very much less than market prices. The army was reduced to a little over 1,000 men, and the people of the Pale, though well disposed, could afford no effective help. Credit was extinct, and the bad money caused great misery. Yet even bad coin was scarce. "Help us, my lord," he wrote openly to Sussex, "help us to money at this pinch, though it be as base as counters." Men, money, and provisions were alike wanting, and the outlook was as dark as could be. Desmond proposed that the Queen should send special commissioners, independent of the government, to inquire into the state of Ireland and point out means of reformation. He himself had perhaps sinned through ignorance, and he thought justice and fair dealing more likely to do the work of civilization than a new conquest. "We neither think it meet nor intend," answered Mary, with a touch of her father's humour, "to make any new conquest of our own, nor to use any force when justice may be showed." She proposed to do all that was necessary by fair means. Sidney's fears of foreign complications were not unfounded. He had no ship of war at his disposal, and he feared that Dublin might be blockaded. George Paris was in France, declaring that the wild Irish were quite ready to transfer their allegiance, and Sidney had reason to believe that Kildare was playing his hereditary game. There can be no doubt that this great nobleman, whose estates lay between the capital and the disturbed Midland districts, was a thorn in the side of each successive governor. It was thought he wanted to be deputy himself, and all the principal lawyers in Dublin had a retaining fee from him. William Pearse, constable of Carrickfergus, the vigilant guardian of the north, was told by one of his men who was present that sorely boy Macdonald, in the careless after-supper hour, said plainly that Englishmen had no right to Ireland, and they would never trust Englishmen more, but would trust the Earl of Kildare, who, quoth, sorely hath more right to the country. The nature of these people is that they will speak what is in their hearts when the drink is in their heads. The love of claret, inherent both in Scottish and Irish chiefs, tended to keep up constant communication with France. The hereditary hatred of England might at any moment counterbalance the jealousy which Scotland felt for the French regent and king. Matrimonial and invasion of Ireland might seem less dangerous than that from which the caution of the Scots lords had just saved England. The recollection of Dundalk was not so fresh as that of Flodden. Lady Tyrone had been closely imprisoned, apparently, by Shane for urging her husband to hold fast to his allegiance. "I will not," says Sidney's informant, "you make this known to the Primate or Kildare or any Geraldine in Ireland." To the Queen the Lord Justice wrote that the coast was infested by hostile cruisers, that he dreaded a French attack on castles which could not resist artillery, and that he could scarcely be answerable for the defence of the country. The effect of Sussex's advice while at court may be gathered from the number of letters which Mary addressed to great men in Ireland. Tyrone and O'Reilly were thanked for past services, the former being charged to help the deputy with a contingent, and the latter to dismiss the Scots in his pay. Calvach O'Donnell was reminded of his duty and encouraged to hope for a peerage and other rewards. Barnaby Fitzpatrick, whose courtly education was not forgotten by his friend's sister, was exhorted to behave like one who regards the service and weal of his natural country. His neighbour O'Carroll might look forward to a peerage for life if he would give help in season. Desmond and Clanricarde were directed to put Thomond in possession of his earldom and estates, the care of the coast being particularly recommended to the former. Desmond and Ormond were thanked and advised to refer all their differences to the arbitration of the Lord Deputy and Council. The Queen did not limit her care for Ireland to writing letters. She doubled the army, 800 men being sent over, and directions given for raising 200 more in Ireland. Every foot soldier was to receive 2d a day, and every horseman 3d a day, in addition to the old wages. The deputy's salary was raised from £1,000 to £1,500 with the usual allowances, and he was directed to move constantly to and fro, residences being maintained for him at Roscommon, Athlone, Monasterevin, Maryborough, Philipstown, Ferns, Enniscorthy, and Carlow. The O'Moores and O'Connors were to be still further chastised, and as much as possible effected against the Scots. In most other matters the former instructions were to remain in force. The restored deputy was not expected to make bricks without straw, more than £200 having been spent on the carriage of munitions to Chester for their Irish service. Sussex left London on March 21, and we are told that he travelled post, but he did not leave Holyhead till the 26th of the following month. The actual passage only occupied a few hours. Detraction, the usual lot of Irish governors, followed him on his journey, his accuser being no less a person than Primate Dowdall, who was summoned over to tell his own story, and who died in London some 3 months before the Queen. Sidney and his council declared that the Archbishop was actuated by personal malice, and that there was no foundation for his statements. There was, however, some excuse for a prelate who saw his metropolis and 3 churches burned by the viceregal army. Sussex believed that Dowdall was in league with his predecessor, were it not, he said, for his set purpose to serve the Queen. He might find occupation enough in avoiding the nets spread on all sides, the catch-line whereof he could not prove but by looking into Mr. St. Leger's bosom. Sussex had left Leix and Offaly in confusion, and he returned to find them in the same state, his brother Sir Henry Radcliffe being actually besieged in Maryborough by the natives under Donogh and another O'Connell, accompanied by Richard Oge, one of the bastard Geraldines who had so long been troublesome. The garrison beat off their assailants after a hard fight, Richard Oge falling by the hand of Francis Cosby, but Donogh again escaped. The first matter which demanded the personal attention of Sussex after his return was the state of Thomond, where Sir Donald More O'Brien, who had slain his brother, the second Earl, 5 years before, was now disputing the title of his young nephew Connor, whose principal castles he held. Ormond, whose aunt was the young lord's mother, was of course interested in his favour, and the same reason was enough to make Desmond inclined to Sir Donald. It became necessary for Sussex himself to go in force and establish some kind of order, taking the familiar line through Offaly and Ely. Leap Castle being abandoned at their approach, the Lord Deputy and his troops, strengthened on the route by the adhesion of Barnaby Fitzpatrick and a considerable force, marched across North Tipperary by Newport and Caherconlish to Limerick, which was reached on the 7th day after leaving Dublin. At a point a few miles from the city, Ormond and his brother Edmund appeared with a large party. The young Lord of Caerhir, Gerald, the heir of Desmond, with all the forces of his house, McCarthy More, who received the honour of knighthood and a gold chain and gilded spurs, and William Burke, chief of the district, joined on the same day. At the gate of Limerick, the mayor and aldermen in scarlet robes delivered to Sussex the keys and mace, which he returned to the mayor. With the civic insignia and sword of state borne before him, the Lord Deputy rode to the door of the cathedral, where the Marian Bishop Hugh Lacy met him, and where he was censed and sprinkled with holy water. Sussex kissed the cross both here and at the Rood, where the same ceremonies were repeated, and knelt devoutly at the high altar while the Te Deum was sung. Salutes were fired after church. The Lord Deputy rested 10 days at Limerick, during which time was performed the rite of bishoping Desmond's youngest child, the old Earl being present himself. This was a first or second baptism, for the little Fitzgerald was not old enough to be confirmed, and the Lord Deputy stood sponsor and gave his godchild his own name, and presented him at the same time with a gold chain. The career of James Sussex Fitzgerald, thus auspiciously begun, was destined to end in a traitor's death on the scaffold. Sir Donald O'Brien failed to appear and was thrice proclaimed traitor at Limerick. Sussex then issued forth into Thomond. Clare Castle and Ennis made no resistance, but a few cannon shot had to be fired at Bunratty before it surrendered. The Earl of Thomond, having been placed in possession of his country, was sworn upon the sacraments and on the relics of the church with bell, book, and candle, to forsake the name of O'Brien and to be true to the king and queen. All the freeholders of the district swore in the same solemn way to obey him as their captain. On his journey westward from Limerick, Sussex spent a night with O'Shaughnessy at Gort, where he dined so worshipfully as divers wondered at it, for the like was not seen in an Irishman's house. At Galway he was received with the same civic, military, and religious ceremonies as at Limerick, and after staying 4 or 5 days, returned by Athenry and Meelick into Offaly, and thence to Dublin. Sidney's apprehensions, partially realized, for James MacDonald landed before Sussex with 600 Irishmen and 2 guns, but Carrickfergus had been reinforced and the greater part of the Scots returned to their own country. Cola MacDonald, one of the chief's 5 brothers and the resident guardian of his clan's Irish interests, died soon afterwards, and his brother Angus, having refused to take his place, Sorley Boy, the youngest and ablest of the family, filled the vacant post. It was decided to attack the Red Shanks in their own islands, and a fleet assembled at Lamb Bay, from which great things were evidently expected. Sussex urged dispatch, but the delays of the supply service were inveterate, and nothing was done for nearly 3 weeks. The Lord Deputy landed first in Cantyre, and began operations by burning James MacDonald's chief house, called Sandal, a fair pile and a strong. He boasted that in 3 days he burned everything from sea to sea in a district 20 miles long, and this without meeting any opposition worth notice. Isla was the great object of the expedition, but the wind was unfavourable, and the incendiaries' work could be carried on elsewhere. Erin was accordingly devastated, the army dividing into 2 so as to make the damage more complete. Isla being still inaccessible, the same fate was intended for Bute, but just as the boats were about to be manned, a sudden gale sprung up, and that being then the weather shore, the wind wheeled suddenly and made it the lee shore, whereby we, being very near the shore, were forced to ride it out for life and death in such a place, and as if any tackle had slipped or broken, the ship whose tackle had so slipped or broken must needs have perished. The cable of a Dublin transport parted, and she foundered with a loss of 28 men. Most of the small vessels got into harbour, but the masters of H.M.'s ships, I think, thought scorn thereof. The fine gentlemen who commanded men of war in those days were unwilling to take advice from the old seamen who acted as their sailing masters or pilots. With loss of boats running, rigging, and anchors, the fleet escaped, and the captains, whose courage was somewhat cooled, were content after this to be controlled by their professional associates. The poor little Cumbraes, having been ravaged, the disabled vessels were just able to reach Carrickfergus after a dead beat against a stiff northwester. Sussex landed and was nearly lost in regaining his flagship and the Mary Willoughby. A council of war was then held, and it was found that there were provisions for only 3 weeks more, and that damages could not be properly repaired in Ireland. Only 3 ships were at all fit for service, and moreover the new bark is a ship of such length and unwieldiness in steerage as she is not to be ventured among the isles in such stormy weather, where there be many deep and narrow channels and strong tides. It was feared that the ships might be becalmed or otherwise delayed in the isles. There was now no spare tackle in case of future storms, and it was by no means impossible that the crews and troops might starve. The hope of visiting Isla was therefore abandoned, and Sussex landed the soldiers with the less ambitious intention of attacking the Scots in the rout. An English fleet and army, carefully equipped and commanded by many gallant gentlemen, had just succeeded in burning some barren islands, not without considerable loss to themselves, and had returned disabled without striking a blow. Sussex was conscious of his failure, and begged the Queen not to impute any lack in me, but to consider that whatever I wrote of was feasible, is feasible, and shall, with grace of God, be put in execution with a great deal more than I wrote of, etc. The expedition is not even noticed in the Scots correspondence of the time, nor was anything done to retrieve matters on land. Out of 1,100 soldiers, but 400 were fit for service, the rest being prostrated by illness caused by the foul water on board ship. Want of activity, at least, could not be charged against Sussex, who carried out strictly the spirit of the Queen's instructions, which desired him to be constantly on the move. He was at Leighlin a few days after his return from Scotland, and then returned to Dublin, where the affairs of Munster occupied his attention. The old Earl Desmond was dead, and his son Gerald, destined to a disturbed life and a miserable death, succeeded to the splendid but troublesome inheritance of the Southern Geraldines. He promised fair, and was knighted by the Lord Deputy's hands, who went to Waterford to receive his homage and to admit him to the earldom. Sir Maurice Fitzgerald of Decease, who ruled about 1/2 of the country of Waterford, also made his submission, promising to obey the law and make others obey it, to give his help to all judges, commissioners, and tax-gatherers, and to secure free admission for all to the markets at Waterford, Dungarvan, and elsewhere. The news of Mary's death reached Ireland soon after this, and Sussex, who had already obtained leave to go to England, hurried away to pay his court to the new sovereign. He left Ireland tolerably quiet. Mary did all that she could to face her father's anti-Roman policy, but no Irish persecution took place. This may have been less from the Queen's want of will than from the insignificance of the Protestants in Ireland. It is said that many people fled from the western parts of England in hope of sharing the comparative immunity enjoyed by the small Protestant congregation in Dublin. One story seems to show that this had attracted attention, and that Dublin would have not long escaped. It rests on the testimony of Henry Usher, one of the fathers of Trinity College, and afterwards Archbishop of Armagh, and was repeated by his more famous nephew James Ussher, and by other public men of repute. Henry Ussher died at a great age in 1613, and was treasurer of St. Patrick's as early as 1573. In the absence of anything to rebut it, such evidence can hardly be rejected. The story is that a Protestant citizen of Dublin, named John Edmonds, had a sister living at Chester, married to one Mattershed, who kept an inn or lodging house, in which Cole, Dean of St. Paul's, slept when on his way to purge the Irish Church. Here, said Cole in the hearing of his hostess, is a commission that shall lash the heretics of Ireland. The good woman watched her opportunity, possessed herself of the doctor's wallet, and substituted a pack of cards for the commission, a service for which she received a pension of £40 from Queen Elizabeth. On reaching Dublin, Cole went straight to the castle, where the Lord Deputy, who had just returned from his Scotch expedition, was sitting in council. Cole declared his business in a set speech, but when the secretary opened his wallet, he found only the cards, with the knave of clubs uppermost. Sussex had conformed to the dominant creed, but had probably no wish to be a persecutor, and may have rejoiced at Cole's discomfiture. "Let us have another commission," he said, "and we will shuffle the cards in the meanwhile." A new scourge for the heretics was dispatched, but before it came to hand, Mary's unhappy career had closed. The weak enthusiasts who, far more than Gardiner or Bonner, must share the responsibility for the persecution with which this queen's name is inseparably connected, was not long divided from her in death. Reginald Pole survived his kinswoman some 22 hours, and almost the last sounds to reach his ears were the cheers with which a people that breathed freely once more greeted the accession of Queen Elizabeth. End of Chapter 18, Part 2. End of Ireland Under the Tudors by Richard Bagwell, Volume 1.